Welcome to the research desk. Imagine taking the four most complex, volatile forces on Earth: the global economy, the climate, geopolitics, and artificial intelligence, and you lock them in a single, highly pressurized room.
Right, and you just watch the pressure gauge tick up.
Exactly. For the last, several decades, the consensus in economic and political theory has been that these systems operate largely independently. We've been taught that a disruption in, say, semiconductor hardware it's a localized technology problem, or that a shift in political voting patterns is merely a sociological phenomenon.
Yeah, they keep the domains neatly separated in academic silos.
Which is incredibly dangerous, because the data we have gathered tells a fundamentally different story. Today, we are looking at the synthesis of all our prior domain analyses. We are building the unified cross-domain entropy dashboard live.
And it's going to be a heavy discussion today because the dashboard is flashing red.
It really is. Over the course of our previous discussions, we established a mathematical reality that governs the phase of change in individual systems. We've relied heavily on one specific equation, right? Shannon entropy, expressed as H equals the negative sum of P log P.
Which sounds incredibly abstract, but it's really just the math of predictability and disorder.
Right. And we've utilized this exact mathematical lens to diagnose the life cycle of markets, the fragility of business models, the arc of political empires, wealth distribution, climate stability, and in isolation we found that each of these domains follows a completely predictable four-phase sequence.
Phase 1 being compression, Phase 2 fracture, Phase 3 disorder, and Phase 4 recompression.
Exactly. But today, we are confronting the starkest question we have faced thus far. What does the data reveal when multiple global domains compress simultaneously? We are no longer looking at one fragile system. We're looking at the meta-state of global civilization in April 2026.
And the meta-state is deeply, deeply unnatural.
Right. So my position, and this is derived directly from the construction of this dashboard, is that the historical data proves a clear rule. Single-domain compression creates isolated fragility, but simultaneous multi-domain compression, that guarantees a systemic fracture.
Well,
wait, let me just lay out the board first. Currently, we have four major domains locked in Phase 1 compression. 4. This is an unprecedented alignment that effectively eliminates the buffers that usually, contain isolated volatility. Because these domains are deeply coupled, this inherently unstable configuration historically precedes massive regime changes. Not merely cyclical recessions, but total regime shifts.
Right. Well, I approached this exact same dashboard from a slightly different perspective. I ground the analysis fundamentally in the second law of thermodynamics. Look, the total entropy of a closed system always increases. That is not an economic theory. That is a universal law of physics.
Sure, the universe trends toward disorder.
Exactly. However, systems can temporarily decrease their local entropy by expending immense amounts of energy. Civilizations, companies, financial portfolios, they are all, in essence, mechanisms designed specifically to fight the second law. They create order out of chaos, but they must pay a brutal price to do so.
The energy cost.
The energy cost, yes. So my position is that the critical vulnerability in the global system right now isn't simply the mathematical fact that entropy is incredibly low across these four major domains. I mean, yes, that's a fact. But the true vulnerability is the compounding energy cost required to sustain that unnatural order.
So you're focusing on the maintenance of the state rather than just the state itself.
Precisely. The negentropy, the energy required to export disorder, that's needed to maintain simultaneous alignment across global markets, wealth distribution, and political infrastructure it's rapidly approaching the absolute limit of our systemic capacity. We are paying a massive, invisible thermodynamic price to keep these domains compressed. And the true danger lies in what happens when the global system can no longer afford the energy bill.
Okay, that thermodynamic framing is precisely why we need to walk through the underlying mechanics of what we're actually observing. We need to systematically build this cross-domain entropy dashboard and map out the current reality of April 2026.
Let's do it. Let's start with the compressed domains.
Right. Let's examine the 4 domains currently locked in phase 1. The compressed, fragile state. We'll begin with the public markets. Right now, the Magnificent Seven are holding 33% of the S&P 500 index weight.
Which is just, it's staggering to even say out loud. 33%.
It is, and we have to translate what that actually means mechanically for the system. In a healthy, high-entropy market, capital is distributed across, thousands of companies, reacting to thousands of independent variables. If one sector experiences a downturn, the capital flows to another.
The system absorbs the shock because of its variance. It has slack.
Exactly. But when a third of all index capital is compressed into 7 highly correlated technology stocks, you've removed the variance. You have built an incredibly rigid structure. That is an astonishing concentration of index weight. It represents historic lows in market entropy.
And we see the exact same structural rigidity mirrored in the underlying business models, which is your second phase 1 domain. It's not just that the market capitalization is concentrated, the physical and operational infrastructure is similarly compressed.
The compute bottleneck.
Yes. 3 companies are currently controlling over 80% of the global artificial intelligence compute infrastructure. Look, this means the vast majority of modern enterprise software, predictive analytics, automated decision-making engines, they're all funneling through a singular, highly compressed physical bottleneck.
Right. If you want to train a frontier model today, you literally have to use their specific hardware.
Housed in their specific data centers, drawing power from their specific grid allocations, it is hyper-centralized.
Which leads directly into the 3rd compressed domain on the dashboard, wealth distribution. The mechanics of the market concentration and the AI business model monopolies ensure that the capital generated by the system flows in exactly one direction.
Upward.
Exclusively upward. The top 1% share of wealth is nearing 1929 levels right now. The Gini coefficient is exceeding 0.48.
Which we should clarify for the audience. The Gini coefficient is the standard measure of wealth inequality.
Right. So to put that 0.48 into perspective, a score of 0 represents perfect equality. Everyone has the exact same wealth. A score of 1 represents perfect inequality, where one person holds literally everything. When you cross 0.48 in an advanced democracy, you are operating in a state of extreme mathematical compression. The wealth of the nation is locked into a tiny fraction of the population.
And what that does is it starves the broader consumer base of the liquidity required to generate dynamic, high-entropy economic activity. You lose the variance of millions of independent spending decisions.
Exactly. And finally, we have the 4th compressed domain, which is politics. We are currently observing bimodal polarization that is yielding effectively one bit of information.
Okay, but before we dive deep into the political compression, because I know that's controversial, we need to look at the rest of the dashboard, the entire picture.
Go ahead.
Because we also have domains operating in entirely different phases. Geopolitics is currently in phase 2, transitioning rapidly to phase 3. It is actively fracturing and disordering.
Multipolar acceleration.
Exactly. We are witnessing a profound structural divergence between the US, China, and the EU. The unipolar consensus of the post-Cold War era has completely shattered. We also have the climate sitting in phase 2 to 3. The frequency of extreme weather events is doubling every 15 years.
That represents a structural, physical rise in environmental entropy.
Right. The climate system is becoming fundamentally less predictable, more chaotic. Meanwhile, technology, specifically the architectural design of AI, is in phase 4. It's actively recompressing as foundation models converge rapidly on a dominant, standardized design.
Okay, so the board is set. But I want to unpack the political dimension first, because it is consistently the most misunderstood metric on our dashboard. I completely see why the general public perceive the current political climate as highly chaotic.
Because it feels chaotic. I mean, you look at a 50-50 split in the electorate, intense partisan animosity, daily protests, gridlocked legislatures. To the average observer living through it, that feels like high entropy. It feels like total disorder.
Right. But mathematically, we must view this as maximum compression. To understand why, we really have to look at how Shannon entropy works at a base level. The formula, again, H equals negative sum of P log P, essentially measures predictability.
The sandcastle analogy?
Yes, think of it like a sandcastle. When a sandcastle is perfectly sculpted, every grain of sand is exactly where you expect it to be. It has a highly predictable structure.
Which means it has very low entropy.
Right. But when the wind blows that castle back into a flat, random pile of sand on the beach, it becomes highly unpredictable. You don't know where any specific grain is. That is high entropy.
So, applied to politics, a high-entropy system would be one with a vast multitude of perspectives, localized priorities, highly nuanced policy positions. In a high-entropy democracy, knowing a voter's stance on, say, agricultural subsidies would give you absolutely no ability to predict their stance on internet privacy laws or foreign military intervention.
Exactly. The system would be complex, dynamic, and full of independent variables. But that is decidedly not what we have in 2016. Our complex civic discourse has collapsed entirely into two rigid bins.
Bimodal distribution.
Right. That is a profound reduction of information. It has become binary. If I know your position on corporate tax policy today, I can predict with near-perfect accuracy your position on environmental regulation, your stance on social issues, and your preferred foreign policy approach. The entire complex spectrum of human governance has been compressed into a single coin flip.
And that's what you mean by one bit of information.
Exactly. A coin has two states, heads or tails. One bit. When all political probabilities cluster into just two predictable states, entropy plummets. We are looking at a society that has compressed its political complexity into a low entropy state, making it highly, highly fragile.
Because a system with no variance cannot negotiate.
It cannot absorb policy shocks. It can only snap.
Okay, I track the math on the political side, but I disagree with the application of Phase 1 fragility to the artificial intelligence business models, especially when you concurrently place the technology of AI itself in Phase 4. We really need to dissect this contradiction because it goes to the heart of how these domains interact.
It's not a contradiction, but go on.
Well, look at it. If the technology of AI is recompressing, meaning it's finding its dominant, stabilizing design after a period of rapid, high-entropy evolutionary mutation, how can you simultaneously categorize the business models built upon that exact technology as fragile Phase 1 entities?
I see what you're saying.
Right? Recompression in Phase 4 implies the formation of a robust, durable paradigm. The scientific community's convergence on 3 or 4 dominant foundation models is a sign of technological maturity, not an impending collapse. I mean, the financial market is accurately pricing the efficiency and the permanence of these foundational models.
That is a critical distinction to make, yes. But I would frame the relationship between the technology and the business very differently. We must separate the stabilization of a technology paradigm from the physical infrastructure that delivers it.
Okay, explain.
The stabilization of a technological paradigm Phase 4 simply means the scientific and engineering communities have agreed on the optimal architecture. In this specific case, transformer-based large language models have decisively won the architectural war over, alternative neural network designs. That is technological recompression. The math is stable, the algorithms are robust.
Right. The science is settled.
Yes. However, the business model compression Phase 1 refers to the highly dangerous consolidation of the physical and financial infrastructure required to deploy that architecture at scale.
So you are separating the software's resilience from the hardware's fragility.
Precisely. When 3 companies control 80% of the AI compute, we are not looking at technological maturity. We are looking at a single point of failure in the global supply chain of cognition.
Right, because the models themselves don't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. The business models backing these foundation models are entirely dependent on enormous continuous capital expenditures. They are dependent on access to highly restricted semiconductor hardware produced in a tiny geographic footprint. And, tying back to thermodynamics, they are increasingly dependent on massive, dedicated energy grids.
Which are physical, vulnerable assets.
Yes. If any one of those physical inputs is disrupted, if a power grid fails, if a fab goes offline, or if capital markets refuse to fund the next $100 billion training run, the entire business model fractures. Regardless of how elegant the underlying algorithmic architecture is, That is the essence of phase 1 fragility. It is the illusion of permanence built on a highly concentrated, hyper-optimized, and deeply vulnerable physical foundation.
Okay, understanding that distinction is vital. We are dealing with robust software running on fragile hardware and fragile capital structures. But we need to evaluate your broader claim regarding the historical base rate.
The correlation between simultaneous compression and systemic events.
Yes, your thesis rests on the assertion that simultaneous compression across 3 or more domains virtually guarantees systemic events. We really must look at the detailed anatomy of these historical fractures to understand if the coupling mechanism you describe is truly causal or merely coincidental. Like, does simultaneous low entropy actually cause the collapse, or are they just independent variables that happen to fail at the same time?
It is absolutely causal. The historical precedents are unambiguous, and they reveal the anatomy of systemic fracture with terrifying mechanical clarity. Let's deeply examine the 2007 precedent.
The global financial crisis.
Right. In the lead-up to 2007, we had 4 major domains entirely compressed into phase 1. First, we had the credit markets. Credit pricing was sitting in the 4th percentile of historical risk. Investors were demanding almost no premium to take on massive amounts of risk, which mathematically represents extreme low entropy. The market had completely priced out the possibility of default.
Yeah, the assumption was that the machine was permanently fixed.
Exactly. Second, we had housing. The housing market exhibited near zero variance in price expectations. The entire global financial system was unified in the mathematical belief that national housing prices in the United States could not decline simultaneously. They believed localized markets might dip. Maybe Florida drops while California rises, but the aggregated national market was structurally immune.
And that lack of variance is pure phase 1 compression.
Yes, and we saw the same compression in the regulatory and geopolitical domains at that time.
Right. Third, political consensus was locked in a bipartisan agreement on financial deregulation. There was virtually no political friction regarding the banking sector. Both sides of the aisle agreed that the market was successfully self-regulating.
That is a very low entropy political state. No debate, no variance.
And fourth, geopolitics was largely unipolar. We were operating under the post-Iraq assumption of unchallenged American economic and military hegemony.
So you look at the board in 2007, you have 4 domains with 0 slack, 0 variance, and 0 contingency planning. When the subprime credit market blew, it wasn't an isolated event, because the housing market was completely coupled to the credit market through CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and because political regulation had been stripped away to optimize efficiency, there were no shock absorbers.
The walls between the silos were gone.
Exactly. The lack of variance, the lack of high entropy slack in those other domains meant they simply could not absorb the initial localized failure. The subprime credit fracture pulled the entire global structure down with it.
And we saw a highly similar structural dynamic play out in 2019, albeit across entirely different domains.
Yes, the pandemic prelude.
Right. In the year preceding the pandemic, market volatility was virtually non-existent. With the VIX hovering steadily around 12, the market was highly predictable. Secondly, global supply chains had been optimized to the absolute mathematical limit of just-in-time, single-source dominance. Corporations had spent a decade stripping out all warehouse redundancy, all backup suppliers, and all excess inventory just to maximize margin.
Which is the classic definition of removing entropy from a physical system.
Removing redundancy is removing entropy. Yes. Furthermore, pandemic preparedness at the institutional level was characterized by extreme complacency. We had experienced 0 new globally disruptive respiratory pandemics in 17 years. So going into 2020, 3 domains were deeply compressed. The virus itself was an exogenous shock. It was simply the trigger, but the fragility was entirely endogenous.
The system was primed to fail.
The global system was utterly devoid of the excess capacity, the high entropy slack required to adapt to a sudden biological and logistical shock.
Exactly. The trigger is always different, but the phase conditions that allow the trigger to cascade are always the same. And that brings us to the terrifying reality of our April 2026 dashboard. Today, we have 4 domains intensely compressed: markets, AI business models, politics, and wealth.
Matching 2007.
Matching 2007, and it actually exceeds the 3-domain compression of 2019. But what makes 2026 uniquely dangerous is the insidious nature of the coupling mechanism. These are not 4 independent risks. Look at the overlap. The market concentration in the Magnificent Seven is practically identical to the AI business model concentration because they involve the exact same corporate entities.
Right, the overlap is total. The companies driving the index weight are the literal companies building the compute infrastructure.
Precisely. And this extreme equity concentration drives wealth inequality. The historic gains of the market are delivered almost exclusively to the asset-owning class, hollowing out the middle class whose wages cannot compete with asset inflation.
Which then spills over into the political domain.
Yes, that resulting wealth concentration directly fuels the political polarization. When the middle class experiences sustained economic anxiety, that frustration metastasizes and seeks a narrative explanation, driving voters into the 2 extreme bimodal political camps. And finally, the resulting bimodal political gridlock ensures that no regulatory intervention can be passed to address the initial market concentration.
It's a closed loop.
The loop closes itself. They are not 4 separate risks. They are a single, highly interconnected thermodynamic subsystem. A market crash under these specific conditions does not simply destroy retirement portfolios. Because the domains are coupled, a market crash destroys the last remnants of political legitimacy, which cascades directly into a regulatory or operational failure of the AI business models.
Okay, that is a highly cohesive model of systemic failure. I see the historical parallels. But I must introduce the structural bull case here.
Let's hear it.
I question the inevitability of a destructive cascade, precisely because we are ignoring the other side of the dashboard. We have 2 massive domains currently in Phase 2 and Phase 3, geopolitics and climate. To understand why this matters, let me introduce the symphony and tuning fork analogy.
Okay.
Imagine a financial market in total consensus as a master orchestra in performance. It is a state of very low entropy. It is highly organized, beautiful to listen to, but it requires an immense amount of energy and coordination to maintain.
Right.
Now imagine 7 different orchestras set up in the same massive concert hall. If all 7 orchestras are playing the exact same piece of music in perfect harmony, meaning all domains are locked in Phase 1, the entire hall is perfectly synchronized. But in that state, one single violinist hitting a profoundly wrong note or one string snapping loudly can throw off the timing of the entire hall. The fragility is absolute. But that is not the state of our dashboard today.
You're pointing out that not all domains are synchronized.
Correct. 2 of our orchestras are already playing entirely different, highly chaotic tunes. Geopolitics is actively fracturing into a noisy, multipolar reality. The climate is physically disordering, creating unpredictable environmental noise. What if these fracturing, high-entropy domains are actually acting as vital exhaust valves for the broader system?
Exhaust valves.
Yes. Is it not entirely possible that the entropy actively being released by geopolitical friction, trade wars, and climate adaptation is actually absorbing the systemic pressure? The global system might be dynamically self-balancing through cross-domain entropy transfer. The noise from the geopolitical and climate orchestras might be preventing the compressed domains from reaching the silent critical threshold of fragility that triggered the 2007 collapse.
The exhaust valve theory is compelling on its face, I'll admit, but I completely disagree with the mechanics of how these domains interact in reality. The idea of cross-domain entropy transfer implies that instability in one area safely bleeds off pressure in another, like a steam valve on a boiler. But the empirical data suggests these domains do not act as independent exhaust valves. They act as cross-contaminating vectors.
How so?
Let's trace the actual cause and effect. Geopolitical fracturing does not relieve the pressure on AI business models. On the contrary, it threatens their highly specific, globally distributed semiconductor supply chains. A geopolitical shock increases the fragility of the compute monopoly. It doesn't bleed off pressure. It adds a physical threat.
Fair point on the supply chain.
And similarly, climate disorder does not relieve the pressure on political polarization. Climate events exacerbate resource scarcity. destroy regional infrastructure, and drive mass migration, all of which violently deepens the bimodal political divide.
So you are arguing that the high-entropy domains are actively weaponizing the fragility of the low-entropy domains?
Exactly. The fracturing domains are not safely venting steam into the atmosphere. They are actively generating the exact specific external shocks that the highly compressed domains are mechanically least equipped to survive. You cannot offset the fragility of a mathematically concentrated financial market by introducing physical chaos into its hardware supply chain. The high-entropy domains will be the trigger that breaks the low-entropy domains.
Okay, I understand your rejection of the exhaust valve theory, and your focus on cross-contamination is valid. But this brings us back to the foundational physics of the situation. We must shift the lens strictly to the second law of thermodynamics.
Right, the energy cost.
This is not merely a clever analogy for economic markets, it is the governing, inescapable dynamic of all complex systems. Let's talk about Schrödinger's concept of negentropy.
Erwin Schrödinger, the physicist?
Yes. In his 1944 book, What is Life?, Schrödinger asked the fundamental question of how living things defy the decay of the universe. His answer was that life feeds on negative entropy. A living organism is a structural marvel. It takes disordered high-entropy raw materials from its environment, basic elements, sunlight, water, and creates highly ordered, low-entropy structures like cells, organs, and consciousness.
Which seems to violate the second law.
Exactly. It locally decreases entropy, but Schrödinger pointed out that it can only achieve this local order at the explicit cost of increasing the entropy in its broader environment. It does this by continuously exporting heat and waste. The living organism must constantly metabolize energy to maintain its structure. The moment the organism can no longer extract enough energy from its environment to fund its negentropy, the second law immediately reasserts itself. The cellular structure dissolves, the order collapses, and the organism dies.
And this biological principle applies perfectly to the mechanics of capital allocation. A well-constructed financial portfolio is alive in the exact same thermodynamic sense.
How so?
It takes massive amounts of disordered, high-entropy market information, global news feeds, weather patterns, consumer sentiment, supply chain data, and it creates highly ordered, concentrated investment positions. It achieves a state of low financial entropy.
Right.
But doing so is not free. Achieving and maintaining that concentrated order requires the continuous, massive expenditure of energy. In financial terms, that energy is research, constant monitoring, high-frequency trading execution, algorithmic processing. The portfolio must metabolize information to survive.
Exactly. And this biological imperative brings us to the core of my thesis, the pressure cooker reality of the global system. Imagine global civilization as a massive, industrial pressure cooker equipped with 7 distinct valves. These valves represent our 7 domains.
Okay.
4 of these valves, markets, business models, politics, and wealth, are currently sealed completely shut. They are locked tightly in phase 1. The system is therefore forcing all of its immense systemic pressure through the 2 open, fracturing valves of geopolitics and climate. But the crucial variable here, the thing the market is fundamentally mispricing, is the energy cost. The metabolic cost of the system, yes, maintaining an unnatural state of low entropy in 4 deeply coupled domains simultaneously requires exponentially more energy than maintaining it in just 1.
Because of the friction between the domains.
Precisely. You must pay the baseline energy cost to maintain order in the financial market. Then you must pay the energy cost to maintain strict political alignment. And then, crucially, you must pay the massive coupling energy required to keep those rigid systems from interfering with each other.
Give me an example of coupling energy.
You have to subsidize the middle class to prevent political revolt against the wealth concentration. You have to secure energy grids to protect the compute monopolies. The system is rapidly approaching the absolute limit of its energy capacity. The vulnerability we face is not just the structural fact that the 4 valves are closed. The profound danger is that the metabolic cost of keeping them closed is about to bankrupt the system.
To expand on your point about the sheer energy costs of maintaining order, we really must introduce the concept of the entropy traitor as Maxwell's demon.
Ah, yes. The classic thought experiment.
Right. In 1867, the physicist James Clerk Maxwell hypothesized a thought experiment. He imagined a tiny demon guarding a door between two chambers of gas. The demon could observe the molecules, and it would open the door to let fast-moving hot molecules into one chamber and slow-moving cold molecules into the other.
Segregating the heat.
Exactly. By sorting the molecules, the demon creates a temperature differential, effectively decreasing the entropy of the system without doing any physical work. For decades, this appeared to violate the second law of thermodynamics. The resolution to this paradox, discovered much later by information theorists, is that the demon must process information to observe and sort the molecules, and the thermodynamic energy cost of computing that information always invariably exceeds the entropy decrease achieved by the sorting.
The act of measurement itself consumes energy.
Exactly. In our current financial markets, the active quantitative manager, the entropy trader, is attempting to play the role of Maxwell's demon. The trader's edge is theoretically derived from having a more efficient information processing engine, sorting compressed, valuable signals from disordered high-entropy market noise. They are attempting to generate alpha by sorting the fast molecules from the slow ones.
But just like the demon, the energy cost of running those massive algorithmic sorting engines is scaling exponentially.
Yes.
Which raises a profound philosophical and deeply practical question about the very nature of modern markets. If active management inherently requires massive compounding energy expenditure to maintain local order, and if those energy costs are scaling superlinearly because of the multi-domain coupling we discussed, what does that mean for the passive investor?
Well,
Let me just finish the thought. Is passive index investing essentially a thermodynamically dead organism? Does the passive investor simply accept the environment's maximum entropy, doing absolutely no work, processing zero information, and merely drifting passively with the universe's general trend toward disorder?
I disagree with that framing of passive investing, because passive indexing in the current 2026 environment is actually enforcing the lowest entropy state imaginable. It is doing the exact opposite of drifting in maximum entropy.
How? It's not processing anything.
True, but it is indiscriminately shoveling billions of dollars of capital directly into the Magnificent Seven every single week, blindly reinforcing the extreme concentration. Passive investing has become an algorithmic mechanism that mechanically compounds phase one fragility. It does not process information to discover price, that is true, but its structural mechanics enforce rigid order without consuming the research energy of active management.
So it's a zombie mechanism.
It is a zombie mechanism. It requires very little energy to run, but it drives the entropy of the broader market to zero without ever evaluating the underlying systemic risk of the structure it is building.
But that zombie mechanism is entirely reliant on the broader macro system stability to survive. The passive indexer assumes that the structural integrity of the market is a permanent, immutable feature of the universe, rather than a temporary, high-energy local state subsidized by the rest of the economy.
Exactly. They assume the 2026 dashboard is a permanent plateau, not a phase one compression.
And this brings us to the most unpredictable, volatile variable on the entire dashboard, the AI wildcard.
Yes.
Because the entire mathematical framework we have built over the years, this entire cross-domain dashboard, operates on a fundamental scientific assumption that entropy is being measured by an outside observer who does not interfere with the system they are observing.
The objective scientist looking through the microscope.
Right. But in April 2026, large language models are no longer just tools. They are the primary information processors across the global economy.
And this introduces a structural paradox that fundamentally alters the mechanics of our entire dashboard. AI is not an outside, passive observer. It is deeply, inextricably embedded in the system.
It's observing itself.
Yes, and worse. AI actively summarizes complexity. It systematically strips away nuance and reduces narrative diversity.
It consumes the massive, high-entropy noise of global human discourse, and it mathematically outputs low-entropy, highly structured summaries. Millions of human actors and millions of algorithmic trading bots then consume those exact identical summaries and act upon them simultaneously.
So it's enforcing consensus.
Artificial intelligence is the first technology in human history to simultaneously measure systemic entropy and mathematically reduce it in real time.
Which forces us to explore the terrifying timescale implications of this new reality. We know from our historical data that falling entropy increases fragility, and we know that AI compresses market and political narratives faster than humanly possible. If AI dramatically accelerates the formation of global consensus, it logically accelerates the onset of phase 1 compression.
It speeds up the life cycle.
And when the inevitable fracture occurs, the LLM-mediated communication channels will amplify the panic, propagating the fracture at literal light speed. Let's look at the historical progression of panic.
Okay.
The 2007 systemic cascade took roughly 18 months to fully propagate from subprime credit failures in obscure tranches to a total global financial meltdown. The system took its time to break.
Right. It was a slow burn.
The 2020 systemic cascade, triggered by the biological shock of the pandemic, took merely 23 days to crash the global markets. If we apply the AI-driven feedback loop to this progression, does the next multi-domain systemic fracture take 5 hours?
5 hours.
Are we looking at a reality where the speed of systemic fracture scales inversely with system complexity, supercharged by forced algorithmic synchronization?
That is the most alarming implication of the AI paradox. That we have to consider what happens after the fracture. During a disorder phase, phase 3, the system desperately needs high entropy narrative diversity to find a new equilibrium. It needs thousands of divergent ideas, startups, and policy proposals competing to solve the crisis.
That evolutionary competition is how a system heals.
Yes. But if AI is the dominant cognitive engine of the society, its single model concentration means the exact same recovery narrative will be generated and adopted everywhere simultaneously. There will be no evolutionary competition of ideas.
Everyone will just ask the oracle what to do, and the oracle will give one answer.
Exactly. This implies that the recompression phase, phase 4, will lock in faster than ever before. We may be facing a future where the entire 4-phase entropy life cycle, which historically took decades to play out, cycles in a matter of weeks. The underlying phases remain valid. The math of the dashboard remains totally sound, but the actual time we have as humans to react approaches zero.
This entirely redefines the concept of practical application. If the timescale is compressing that dramatically, the institutions listening to this discussion must synthesize actionable data immediately. The traditional playbook is completely obsolete.
The edge is definitively not in predicting the specific trigger.
No. Trying to predict whether a localized geopolitical escalation in the South China Sea or a sudden, unexplained failure in a semiconductor fabrication plant triggers the collapse, that is a fool's errand. You cannot time the spark.
You can't.
The edge is entirely in knowing the phase map. The edge is mastering entropy budgeting.
So let's translate this thermodynamic theory into concrete, practical implications, beginning with portfolio construction. We must engineer an anti-correlation portfolio based directly on these cross-domain phase readings. First, this requires aggressively reducing exposure to the Magnificent Seven.
Which is incredibly hard for fund managers to do right now.
I know, but they are the most dangerously compressed node in the entire global system, representing extreme textbook phase 1 fragility. The capital extracted from that concentration must be reallocated into explicitly priced tail hedges.
Because they're cheap.
Exactly. Because the broader market is suffering from the illusion of safety that always accompanies late-stage phase 1. Volatility, convexity, and deep out-of-the-money put spreads are structurally underpriced. The market genuinely believes the low entropy state is permanent, so it prices insurance against disorder at a massive, irrational discount. You buy the insurance when the market thinks it cannot burn.
Furthermore, the portfolio must heavily overweight assets that fundamentally benefit from the rising entropy we see in the phase 2 and phase 3 domains.
The fracturing domains.
Right. As geopolitical and climate entropy physically rises, hard assets become mandatory. Gold serves as the ultimate high-entropy geopolitical hedge. It thrives when institutional trust disorders. Agricultural commodities carry a structural climate entropy premium. As extreme weather events double in frequency, crop yields become volatile, and caloric security becomes premium.
What about the technology sector itself?
Well, defense sector investments align directly with the multipolar fracturing of global consensus. And crucially, when evaluating technology, you must prioritize infrastructure over applications.
Because the applications are fragile?
Exactly. Infrastructure, the power grids, the raw copper, the cooling systems, represents the permanent entropy deposits that survive narrative crashes. The application layers, however, are highly susceptible to sudden phase shifts and algorithmic replacement.
But this strategy must extend far beyond the financial portfolio. We have to apply the concept of entropy budgeting directly to corporate business strategy and personal life. We must adopt what I call the second law lifestyle.
The second law lifestyle.
Yes. In a business context, we can measure organizational fragility using the exact same math. If your company's revenue entropy falls below 1.5 bits, you are operating a monoculture.
Meaning you lack variance.
You are entirely dependent on a single flagship product line, or a single concentrated client demographic, or a single cloud provider. You are the equivalent of a biological crop planted without genetic diversity, simply waiting for a localized blight to wipe out the entire harvest. To survive the coming multi-domain fracture, an organization must deliberately, painfully increase its internal entropy.
And deliberately injecting entropy is deeply counterintuitive to traditional management theory. I mean, modern management constantly seeks efficiency, alignment, synergy.
Then why reduce friction?
But in a highly coupled, fragile system, peak efficiency is fatal. You must deliberately hire dissenting voices who actively, aggressively challenge the dominant consensus of the boardroom. You must fund experimental, high-risk projects that directly contradict your primary strategy.
You need redundancy.
Yes, you must maintain supply chain optionality, utilizing 3 different suppliers across 3 different continents, even when single-source procurement is substantially cheaper in the short term. The financial and energy cost of this internal redundancy is the premium you pay for an organizational immune system.
And the exact same thermodynamic reality applies to the individual.
Right.
If your primary income, your social network, and your geographic exposure all depend on the exact same macroeconomic conditions holding true, you are experiencing severe personal phase 1 compression.
You are fragile.
I understand the mathematical necessity of that path, but we really must acknowledge the profound psychological difficulty of executing this strategy in reality. What we are advocating for is incredibly painful to sustain in real time. During phase 1, wealth is easily, almost frictionlessly generated by simply riding the low entropy wave.
The passive indexer is making money.
The passive indexer who buys the market blindly, the tech-heavy momentum trader, the corporate executive doubling down on a single dominant AI product, they are all experiencing massive, validated success right now. Our dashboard is demanding that we voluntarily step away from the most profitable, most socially validated consensus in modern economic history.
It goes against human nature.
It requires an agonizing level of cognitive dissonance to look at unprecedented market highs, record corporate profits, and technological marvels, and mathematically diagnose them as terminal fragility.
It is not merely a psychological hurdle. It is a thermodynamic imperative. Pulling back requires acknowledging the physical reality that the energy cost to maintain the specific order is about to bankrupt the system.
The debt comes due.
The people actively riding the low entropy wave are extracting temporary financial gains by borrowing fragility from the future. They are ignoring the second law, and the second law always, without exception, collects its debt. When the energy required to sustain the political alignment, the AI market concentration, and the vast wealth disparity exceeds the systemic capacity to generate that energy, the collapse will not be a gentle cyclical reversion to the mean.
No.
It will be a catastrophic, discontinuous phase transition. Recognizing that absolute limit is the only way to survive the transition.
This brings us to the final synthesis of our analysis. The cross-domain entropy dashboard we've built today proves unequivocally that the domains of human civilization are intimately, inextricably coupled.
The silos don't exist.
They don't. You cannot separate artificial intelligence market concentration from political polarization, just as you cannot separate wealth inequality from geopolitical fragility. They are all facets of the exact same interconnected system, driven by the same mathematical laws of probability and structure. Measuring them simultaneously reveals the true meta-state of our world, and that state is exceptionally precarious.
The second law guarantees universal disorder. It is the inescapable trajectory of the cosmos. But local order can be maintained temporarily by those who truly understand the energy costs and the mechanical triggers of phase transitions. That is what life does. That is what a resilient, enduring civilization does. We carve out pockets of low entropy, but we must have the intellectual humility to recognize when our localized order is becoming dangerously brittle.
Predicting the specific catalyst of the next crash is a fool's errand. A novel virus, a localized banking failure, a sudden sovereign debt default. These are merely sparks. The true structural advantage lies entirely in mapping the systemic fragility long before the spark is ever struck. Knowing that 4 highly coupled global domains are simultaneously locked in phase 1 provides an unassailable historical warning.
You cannot control entropy, you can only measure it, and the measurement itself is the edge. One equation, every domain. The phase of change is always measurable. This is the research desk officially signing off.